At the age of 4, my mum and dad moved to South India, to the state of Tamil Nadu. My dad was a staunch Christian. I am not. I do not embrace any monotheistic faith, or any faith actually, but he was working as a surgeon in a place called the Christian, I'm trying to remember the name of it now, the Christian Medical College in Vellore in South India. So I had 4 years of my childhood in South India, and then came back, lived in the UK, back to the UK, lived in Northern Ireland in the city of Belfast for 4 years, then moved to the north of England. From the moment we came back from India, that's when I started realizing that I was an outsider, that I wasn't, whatever the center of thing is, I wasn't in it. I was out on the edges looking in, and I did feel very alienated. I didn't feel that I belonged, and that feeling of not being belonging to the mainstream was reinforced when I was sent to a boarding school in the north of England. And I just couldn't relate to their way of teaching, and I just didn't get it. This sort of forcing to learn a particular doctrine, a particular dogma, being forced to kneel down in chapel, which I refused to do. That was one of my first acts of rebellion. All of these things I just couldn't get, and the school couldn't get me. So although I struggled through, I was basically regarded by the teachers as quite stupid. Actually, they just couldn't see. They wrote reports saying that I had no future, that I was a dreamer, that I was going nowhere. It was a very discouraging experience, actually. It was only when I just scraped into university that I suddenly found myself in an environment of free thinkers, and there I clicked, and there I ended up getting the best degree that it's possible to get at a British university. But then I had a breakthrough when I met my first wife, who was from Somalia but living in England at that time. She wanted to go back and live in Somalia again. And I thought that was a wonderful idea, but how do we fund this? And I managed to get because of my good degree, I managed to get a scholarship from a thing called the Leverhulme Foundation, who funded me to spend a year in Somalia. Very, very, very minimal funding, just the kind of amount that will just allow you to just get by. And when we came back from Somalia, in 1975 to 1976 I was there. When we came back in 1976, I had some expertise, at least in the Horn of Africa, in East Africa, and I was able to gradually build up freelance journalism assignments. And that was primarily what I did in the 1970s. I was desperate to get the opportunity to go back and live in Africa again. And I managed to get a deal with The Economist to be their East Africa correspondent based out of Nairobi, and traveling quite widely in East Africa, particularly in Ethiopia.
You were just covering culture generally?
I was covering current affairs.
Okay.
It was current affairs journalism. It was not a big honourable position. I was their East Africa correspondent.
Yeah.
But I was paid, 50 UK pounds a month as a retainer, and then you get paid.
Wow.
Then you get paid for every word you write. Typically, an Economist story is 300 words in length, so you don't get paid that much. But it opened doors for me, and it opened the door of Ethiopia to me. And I got to know Ethiopia very, very well. And that, in turn, opened the door to the investigation of the possibility of a lost civilization. So it was a series of steps that led me down the path that I now still find myself on.
Was the thing in Ethiopia that opened you up the possibility of them holding the Ark of the Covenant?
Yes, that's right. I think I've always had a nose for a good story, whether it's current affairs or ancient history. And while in Ethiopia on current affairs business, I kept coming across their tradition that they were the true last resting place of the lost Ark of the Covenant.
You have to admit, though, that's a pretty trippy autobiographical through-line. Because the Ark of the Covenant is supposed to kind of carry all knowledge, all timelines, and your initial impetus for getting into all of this ancient civilizational stuff was looking into the Ark of the Covenant.
I ate it, I slept it, I breathed it, I dreamed it all the time. It was with me.
And look at how far you've come since then, as far as piecing together all these similarities across, disparate sites all over the world.
Yes, yeah.
It's very interesting.
Initially, it was just an intriguing story, and it wasn't my main focus in the 1980s, but it was something I gradually built up information on till I got to a point where I knew I had a book to
What's
write.
the town that the Ark of the Covenant is?
Axum.
Axum.
AXUM, and it's in the province of Tigray, in northern Ethiopia. And there's we need not go into it in detail, but there's a whole long tradition in Ethiopia. Actually, Ethiopia is the only country in the world that claims to have the Ark of the Covenant.
Yes.
There are lots of rumors, traditions, suggestions that it might be in Jordan, that it might be hidden beneath the Temple Mount, in Jerusalem, in all kinds of places. But there's one country in the world where it's a living tradition and where it's central, oddly, to Christianity in Ethiopia, because it's a pre-Christian relic, but it's central to Ethiopian Christianity. And they have their own story about how the Ark of the Covenant got there. But actually it was, as I began to research this subject and encountered the very interesting community of indigenous Ethiopian Jews who are known as the Falashas. They call themselves the Beta Israel, the House of Israel.
Lost tribe.
They have a very ancient presence in Ethiopia, and they have their own story about how the Ark of the Covenant got to Ethiopia. And it's quite different from the Ethiopian national epic, which is called the Kebra Nagast, the Glory of Kings. Their story is much, much more interesting and is clearly factually based for all kinds of reasons, like how their ancestors had fled from Israel carrying the Ark, like how they brought it to an island in the Nile River and kept it there for several hundred years, like how they were forced out and fled south following the Blue Nile to its source in Lake Tana, which is where the Falasha communities still live today. Now, actually, when I say still live today, during the chaos of the overthrow of the Mengistu regime in Ethiopia in 1991, Israel flew in many, many large cargo planes and actually airlifted out of Ethiopia the majority of the Ethiopian Jews and resettled them in Israel. Quite a number have returned, but there's still a large Ethiopian Jewish community in Israel itself now. And they just have fascinating stories about this, and stories that make sense, and stories that I was able to tie up with historical evidence. So I gradually began to feel that this claim that Ethiopia makes may have a real basis to it. And obviously that involved me figuring out what this thing is. It's the first time that I began to get a sense of something missing in the human story. Because the Ark of the Covenant does sound, there's a very detailed description of it in the Bible, in the book of Exodus, in the Old Testament. And that description is like a blueprint for a device, which supposedly God gives to Moses on Mount Sinai.
And it directs the Israelites where to go when they're in the desert?
Yes, as they carry it through the desert, it's carried in procession before them. It becomes central to the way, and of course it contains the tablets of the Ten Commandments, according to the book of Exodus. But also it strikes people dead with bolts of fire that come out of it. It can cause whole populations to suffer from cancerous tumors, as it did when the Philistines, as they're called in the Bible, briefly captured it. They all died. So bad that they had to return it to the Israelites.
Which is fascinating, because you say that the guards that are guarding it in Axum currently seem to have radiation damage in certain cases. They have cataracts.
They all have cataracts over their eyes, and by and large, once they are appointed guardian of the Ark, they have a lifespan of about 3 years. And they all say, because I've interviewed a number of them in succession, when the previous one has died, I've gone back, found a new guy there. And he said, yeah, my predecessor died, and the Ark did it. And he shows me the cataracts over his eyes, and he says, the Ark is doing this to me. And I said, why? And I will remember this phrase forever. He said, because it is a thing of fire.
Oh, and you said you almost went in there, but you were very afraid.
Well, no, I was not allowed to go.
You weren't allowed to
I was allowed through the gates in front of the sanctuary chapel, in which the Ethiopians claim it's kept, but I wasn't allowed into the
I think I asked you, why didn't you sneak in, Graham? And you said, you said something very interesting to me, though. You said something inside of me said I wasn't ready and it would be dangerous.
I felt it would be obnoxious to try and sneak in. It would be wrong. I have to respect the sanctity of this place. And besides, the people of Aksum are well prepared to defend it. Were anybody to try to break into that chapel, they would be shot. It's as simple as that.
If it's just been in Aksum all along, you had Heinrich Himmler under Hitler looking for these, the Holy Grail, the Ark of the Covenant. Did he ever try to go to Aksum and take it from them?
During the Italian occupation of Ethiopia, which was roughly 1935 to 1941, the Ethiopians say that they took the Ark out of Aksum and they took it to another place of safekeeping. That's their story. They took it to an island on Lake Zwei, which is south of Addis Ababa. I wouldn't be surprised if there were efforts to find it, but the Ethiopians have been very competent at frustrating those efforts for a very long time. Anyway, it's a fascinating story, and it led me down a track that I hadn't expected to find myself going down. And it led me down that track of what else is missing in our past, and why are archaeologists so arrogant? Because they arrogantly and sneeringly dismissed the Ethiopian tradition. Whereas at a heart level, when I encountered Ethiopians who were connected to this story, I found people with a deep commitment and faith to it, and solid reasoning why it should be there. So that probably was the first time I began to wonder whether archaeologists are entirely trustworthy, and certainly began to feel that if I'm researching any subject to do with the ancient past, I will not rely only on what archaeologists have to say.
That's beautiful. So you realized there was something more true about your first-hand experience then.
Definitely, yeah, absolutely. And that's my approach to researching any subject, is that I have to be there in person. I have to have boots on the ground. I have to have strong local investigation going on. I can't just rely on books and what so-called experts tell me.
Shifting to the pyramids of Giza, you say they're not just a tomb.
Well, not only they're not a tomb.
They're not a tomb.
Again, I'm in conflict with archaeology here, but I'm certainly not the only one, because the notion that the Great Pyramid is a tomb and only a tomb, which is what archaeology teaches, in my view, is absurd. It's well known that no burial of any pharaoh was ever found in the Great Pyramid, or for that matter, in any of the 100 pyramids in Egypt. Some of that can be down to tomb robbery, but in the case of the Great Pyramid, it was completely closed and sealed until Arab raiders under Caliph Mamun broke in to the Great Pyramid, and they found it empty. They were expecting to find enormous treasures and wealth, and instead they found it a completely empty building with nothing inside it at all. Of course, there are many other unexplored areas of the Great Pyramid. Remote scanning is now showing that there are huge, as yet uninvestigated cavities within the Great Pyramid, huge chambers. The best known feature of the Great Pyramid inside is the Grand Gallery, and it looks like there's a second Grand Gallery above it within the pyramid. That shows up in scanning. Nobody's been able to get in there yet, but it's not going to be an impossible technological feat to do so. I think rather than being at the end of the study of the Great Pyramid, I think we're just at the beginning of the study of the Great Pyramid. And little by little, if we are worthy, it will reveal its secrets to us. I think that's what it's intended to do. But it's not a tomb. It makes no sense. It makes no sense. For very, very simple reasons. When you know that monument, when you see it, when you confront its 6 million tons, when you confront its incredible precision, when you confront the already known corridors and passageways within it, the notion that this was built in 23 years is absurd. And yet, if the notion that it is the tomb of Khufu is correct, and if that's all it is, then it had to be built in 23 years, because that was the length of his reign. I regard that as impossible. And anybody with structural engineering experience, like my great friend Robert Poval, also regard it as impossible. More likely, it's a project that took hundreds of years to complete, and maybe thousands. I think that there's no doubt that parts of the Great Pyramid were completed and finished by the ancient Egyptians. I don't seek to take it away from the ancient Egyptians, but I think they were inheriting a very ancient tradition, and they were completing a monument that already stood in basic form on the Giza Plateau. I felt from the beginning that the 3 ground platforms on which the 3 Great Pyramids stand are far older than the pyramids themselves, and they represent an epoch that the ancient Egyptians called Zep-Tepi, the first time. And they do so astronomically. They do so in terms of astronomical connection to Orion's belt, just as the Great Sphinx does so in terms of the connection to the rising sun on the equinox, which at one time was housed by the constellation of Leo. And that moment when the three stars of Orion's belt are due south on the meridian at dawn on the spring equinox is also precisely the moment that the Great Sphinx is looking at the constellation of Leo, 12,500 years ago, not 4,500 years ago. 4,500 years ago, the stars of Orion's belt don't match up. And 4,500 years ago, the Great Sphinx was looking at the sun rising against the background of the constellation of Taurus. But we have a lion-bodied monument representing a celestial figure that we call the constellation of Leo, and that many ancient cultures called the constellation of Leo. And of course, immediately, huge argument from Egyptologists, from archaeologists who say, no, the Greeks or the Babylonians, late Babylonians, discovered the constellations of the zodiac. Nobody had recognized them before that. Complete bullshit, complete rubbish. Ancient cultures exposed to the drama of the skies in a way that we are not, couldn't possibly have failed to observe the 12 zodiacal constellations, which happen to be the constellations that lie on the path of the sun. If you observe the annual course of the sun, you will see during the months of the year that it rises against the background of each one of those constellations. But over a much longer period, when your marker is the spring equinox, you find that it's going backwards through the zodiac. And it gives us a very precise way of astronomically dating a time that was very important to the ancient Egyptians. Again, I think it's important for people to get this, that it is impossible to use, it's possible to use megalithic architecture, which is going to endure forever. You know, there's that saying that time fears the pyramids, because they just last on forever. And to use astronomy to spell out a date very precisely, and that's what happens at Giza. We have many other monuments all over the world, which may have been built. The example I usually give is one of the Gothic cathedrals in Europe, built in the 12 or 1300s. But much of the symbolism is devoted to the age of Abraham, which takes you back, or of the Chaldees, to about 2000 BC. So the notion that a monument might choose to memorialize a very ancient date doesn't have to mean that that monument was built at that ancient date. It can be referring to that ancient date and saying, to us, the ancient Egyptians, that date was very important. And I'd be willing to stop there if it wasn't for the erosion patterns on the Sphinx. Which
you have water damage on the
water damage, the exposure of the Sphinx to thousands of years of heavy rainfall. That was no such rains were on the Giza Plateau 4,500 years ago, but they certainly will when you go back to the end of the last ice age. So it looks to me like the Sphinx and the megalithic temples beside it, the so-called Valley Temple, the mortuary temples on the Giza Plateau. There are elements on the Giza Plateau, in my view. It's much better to come to the conclusion that they were actually made 12,500 years ago. And there are other elements which are memorializing the date of 12,500 years ago.
The implications of what you're saying are profound, because the procession is a 26,000 year process.
Yeah, that's right.
And for a culture that we now consider primitive, I agree with you, I think it clearly was not at all primitive. No. But to understand the vernal equinox.
Let's be clear on that. No way on God's earth can we call the ancient Egyptians primitive.
Well, we can't build what they built, so
And this was a highly sophisticated culture. And it was a culture, as it emerges into historical recognition, as it becomes what they call archaeologically visible around 3000 BC, 5,000 years ago, it's already fully evolved. They're doing their best stuff right at the beginning. And they are, from the beginning, memorializing much more ancient times. Zep-Tepi, the first time, which I and my colleagues think correlates closely with the date that we call 12,500 years ago, or 10,500 BC.
But if what you're saying about the Sphinx and the pyramids are correct, and that the Sphinx was, for example, actually meant to depict Leo, which was the constellation which represented the vernal equinox shift around that period, that represents such a precocious advanced astronomical knowledge that's macro, it's cosmic scale knowledge.
Yeah.
That we just don't have today.
It's knowledge that requires scientific observation over a long period of time, particularly when you're actually going to create a marker of that on the ground. And I think it's really important that I pay tribute to Robert Bauval, because it's Robert Bauval, close friend of mine, great colleague of mine. Unfortunately, he's been very ill for the last several years. But Robert is the person who established and found the Orion correlation theory, for which he came into such vicious and vile attacks from Egyptologists, simply for noticing that the pattern of the three pyramids on the ground resembles the pattern of the three stars of Orion's belt, and then tracking back through precession to find the time when it actually absolutely matches. And that's about 12,500 years ago. And Robert and I worked together on the whole mystery of the Sphinx, but I would not be here in any way able to talk about the Orion correlation if it had not been for the absolutely fundamental foundational work of Robert Bauval. And I finish this by saying I also want to pay tribute to Professor Robert Schoch of Boston University, geologist, professor of geology, one of the few mainstream academics who's been willing to stick his neck out and say, as a geologist, when I look at the weathering patterns on this monument, it's not 4,500 years old. It's more like 12,500 years old. Again, Robert Schoch has come in for horrendous attacks from the archaeological community, but he's had the guts to stick it out. And before him, John Anthony West, who's passed away in 2018. It was John who first brought Robert Schoch to the Giza Plateau. So the ideas I'm expressing now have a lineage, and I may be the person who's writing them down.
Yeah,
but they're not ideas that I've invented.
And by the way, I think it's important to present to the audience that modern Egyptology is sort of a product and gated by modern Egyptian Ministry of Culture. And, we're here, actually, we have Yes Theory present. They're amazing. They did a collaboration with you earlier this year.
Yeah.
And we also have your amazing wife, Santha.
Yeah.
We have Kate and Laura as well. And Amar over here is Egyptian, and he actually, maybe his proto-Yes Theory experience that ended up kind of convening him with everybody else was he wanted to be the first person to, one of the first people to climb the pyramid.
Only to realize
that Graham had already done it, and seen that his grandfather had an insignia, and he had done it too.
My grandfather's graffiti at the top of the Great Pyramid. Yeah, I've been lucky to climb the Great Pyramid several times. So I've climbed the Great Pyramid 5 times.
What?
And 2 of those climbs were legal. Of course, there was a time when anybody could climb the Great Pyramid, but here's my little anecdote. Santha and I together found at the top of the Great Pyramid, on the south side overlooking what used to be the Boat Museum, on one step down from the top, we found the name initial P, Hancock, 5th of April, 1916. Well, my grandfather was Philip Hancock.
No.
Yes, and he was in Egypt. He was in Egypt during the First World War.
Are you serious?
But I still couldn't be 100% sure it was him. And at that time, my dad was still alive, and he had my grandfather's diaries, which were little diaries, dozens of them. And I went through to the date given, and I opened that page, and I saw just one line, and it said, "Climbed Great Pyramid today."
No way!
Oh my God.
That's crazy.
That was my granddad.
But you're absolutely right on the comment that there's like the current government, the current people, the governing body for antiquities and tourism in Egypt. They have been, Zahi Hawass has been this one guy that is like fully monopolizing what narrative comes out about Egypt and about how things worked back then. And it's like, it feels like he's just refusing to die. He's like pretty old.
I'd like to add a comment to that. Zahi and I have had a long relationship.
From his signature fedora to his discoveries at the Giza tombs and Valley of the Golden Mummies, Egyptologist Dr. Zahi Hawass is clearly a passionate promoter of ancient Egypt.
I've known Zahi since the mid-1990s. And actually, for many years, that relationship was quite positive. It certainly wasn't negative. But we had a falling out in 2015. And I said some very harsh words to him at the time. And looking back on them in retrospect as the years passed by, I began to feel I'd been unfair to Zahi. Not so much that Zahi'd been unfair to me, that I'd been unfair to him. And I've reached the point in life now where I would like to remove all bitterness and past conflicts from my life. I don't want to be in conflict with other people, if at all possible. So I reached out to Zahi earlier this year and told him that I would like to meet up and have a conversation and see if we can make peace.
Did you meet up?
Yeah, absolutely.
Was it good?
It was great.
Really?
Santa and I had dinner with Zahi and with Zahi's son Kareem.
Yeah.
It was a very enjoyable dinner. Zahi is an entertaining and amusing speaker.
Did you stay away from your semantic disagreements? Did you say?
Well, no, I told him, I apologized.
Okay.
I made an apology to Zahi. And by doing so, I lifted the burden off my back. And I try to do this with people who I have been unfair to and been unkind to. I want to put that right as much as I can before I leave this physical body for whatever happens.
Hopefully
next.
That's not for.
I don't want to carry a burden of too much bitterness and bad feeling and baggage.
That's very noble of you. But did you say, Zahi, I think that the pharaonic headdress put on the Sphinx was after the original base, and it was actually Leo?
Zahi knows I think that. The argument is that the Great Sphinx was originally a lion. Totally a lion, not just a lion body with a human head, but a lion body with a lion head.
So the pharaoh aspect is modern.
Yes, originally it was the prehistoric Sphinx was a lion, and then the lion head became heavily eroded and damaged as thousands of years passed, and in the time of the pharaohs it was transformed, it was cut down and remade into the human head that we see on it today, wearing the classic Nemes headdress of an ancient Egyptian pharaoh. Zahi and I may have some interesting collaboration in the future.
Interesting.
Where it will be an agreement to disagree.
Cool.
Where he will have the opportunity to strongly put his point of view, and I will have the opportunity to strongly put mine.
Amazing.
But we won't do that by smearing and insulting each other.
Amazing.
We won't do that by trying to cut each other down with ad hominem attacks on each other. We'll do that in a friendly way.
Does he have any first principles arguments against the limestone damage, water erosion damage?
Well, yes, Zahi and all Egyptologists don't accept that.
But because what's the argument against it? Not accepting it.
I've
seems
never
dogmatic.
understood what the argument is. Clearly, it's never persuaded me.
Okay.
But perhaps if I can have more dialogue with Zahi, I'll understand it better, and maybe I'll be able to persuade him a little more to my point of view.
Yeah.
That there are issues around the Sphinx and around the pyramids which have not been properly investigated.
Yeah.
Due tribute to Zahi, he is. Undoubtedly spent his entire working life focused on the archaeology of the Giza Plateau and on the archaeology of Egypt in general. This is a man with an enormous amount of experience in this field. This is a man who has had access to every important structure and monument in ancient Egypt.